topic that I chose to look at and study is Fanny Crosby and her life and her impact on American music and American Protestant faith in the 1800s. But just to give you a little bit kind of recap of what's going on in the 1800s, of course, the 1800s is a time of a lot of political, cultural, and religious upheaval in the United States. The century starts with the War of 1812. We have the Mexican conflict, and then, of course, the big conflict of it is the Civil War. And the Civil War, of course, is often called the War of Brothers, and it's rending apart families, it's rending apart our nation's government, our geography, and then, of course, our churches as well are splitting on questions over freedom for all men. Is that what is part of our Declaration of Independence? It's splitting on states' rights versus the size and scope of federal government, and who are we loyal to, and do we have a right to resist when we think a government is tyrannical? And so that's kind of this era in which Fanny is born. She's born in March 24th, 1824. So she's going to grow up. She's going to grow up hearing about what those events and things being discussed, whether in church or amongst her family members. And then, of course, the century ends in the 1800s with the industrial era in the United States. And that's going to lead to a lot of technological change, which, of course, changes how Americans are spending their time, the kind of occupations that they're going to be involved in. And then we also have a massive wave of immigration in the United States, coming primarily this time rather than from Northern Europe, coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they're bringing with them some cultural differences, some language differences, and some religious differences that Americans really struggled to assimilate in the late 1800s. And so denominations and churches are splintering and they're fracturing around some of these changes. And Fanny is in the midst of all this. And of course, her background is coming of age in this period of history. But the thesis that I am going to be researching and working towards is that Fanny Crosby's music became a unifying force for the Protestant faith in an American world that was divided by politics, culture, and race, and that ultimately her music is going to lead to the success of Moody and Sankey's revival campaigns in the late 1800s. And I think this is true because Fanny's music moved beyond denominational divides and basically took Americans back to there's this simple gospel message that applies to all of us, regardless of which strata of society we belong to, where we come from, what our differences politically may be, but these are the basics and these are the same. And of course, that was the message that Moody was preaching in his revivals, and that's what the message her music conveyed. And when we look at Fanny's background and lifestyle, we can see that she actually has contact with a number of different religious faiths in the United States. Her family had come across in early American history Calvinist Puritans. Her family, when she was born, her immediate family was Presbyterian. Then later she attends some Methodist meetings, really forms some ties there, and then ends up in the holiness movement in her later life. And so she seems to kind of cross these denominational boundaries and really just kind of find friends in all of them. And so I think looking at her music can hopefully help us find some things that are the same amongst Americans rather than all these different denominational differences. So Fanny grows up blind. If you know her story, she goes blind at 6 months. And of course, in that period of history, we don't have a lot of aid for those who are handicapped in that manner. And so it isn't until she's 15 that she gets a chance to go to the Institute for the Blind in New York, and really just embraces that she finally has this chance to gain this formal education. Then she is going to publish her first hymn right at the end of the Civil War in 1864. You kind of see at this point in her music a military theme, which of course, considering the time period, it does make a lot of sense. But one of her songs from that period was Onward, Upward, Christian Soldier, and it kind of had a marching sound, marching rhythm to it. And then as she, we move on, she has contact with some tunists, I guess you would call them, who are going to put her poetry to music, one of them being William Doane, who is going to be a lifelong friend and take a lot of her poetry and turn it into music. But her music is going to include some 7,000 works by the time of her death in 1915. And they were still talking about her in the 1920s in newspapers, and even across in the Atlantic and in Great Britain they were reporting about her music and her life. So she has quite an impact on American music, but also on American religion. And so I hope to, in my